Chapter 29. The House Comes Home. When the old man decided to lay down the load, a whole lot of years ago, it was Depression time, and he, like nearly everybody we knew, had stuck a whacking big mortgage on the house. It wasn't much of a mortgage for these times, but it was computed in thousands, and was as hopeless of repayment as if it had been counted in millions. Anybody in those days who had a cent squirreled off in the much darned sock was a very rich man. Anybody who could command a certain amount of skinny credit at the store for the basic beans and fatback was richer than most folks. The earliest 30s were not a time for mortgage lifting, even if the bank that held the mortgage wasn't bust. So when the old man decided that the thing he had would kill him, and it did, and with Miss Lottie already gone ahead of him, and everybody broke and discouraged, the rich old fellow who held the mortgage just naturally foreclosed it, as was his right. The man who foreclosed it, some said, was a skinflint, and maybe he was. Well, the family busted up and scattered every which way, and nobody looked like ever making any money at all, so the old fellow who now owned the house decided to rent it after a decent period of mourning, but he'd swore he'd never sell the old place to anybody but a member of the family so long as he lived. He loved the house, too, most as much as, and maybe more than some of the people who had eaten and drunk in it, and hunted and fished out of it. It was a fine old house, and most of my life with the old man was spent in and around it. It was located in Southport, the sleepy little North Carolina town I've written so much about. The town with the cedar bench where the old men loafed to whittle and chew tobacco and argue, the Pilots' Association where the men sat with spyglasses and gazed out past Battery Island and Caswell to the sea, Mr. Rob Thompson's pool parlor where the racier element hung out on the rainy days, Mr. Price Furpless picture show, the Amuzu, Watson and Leggert's drugstore, and Gus McNeil's filling station, all social centers of a town which had an oak grove called the Grove and a street called the Street. The house was square, and in those days, so long ago, was painted yellow. It sat on a corner next to a smaller oak grove, which we played one-a-cat. It was right next door to Uncle Tommy, and catty corner on the street from Uncle Walker, and right across the street from old Sam Watts, who had the best deerhounds in town. Some people said Sam set more store by his hounds than he did his young'uns. The house was set up on brick stilts, and I spent many a rainy day under it, rummaging through the trove of generally non-functional treasures a small boy is apt to find under a house in the days before they had basements to store truck in. There were exciting things like the old man's hunting tents and boats hauled up from the water for recalk, busted oars and ragged cast nets and crates of old yellowing magazines, and even Miss Lottie's moldy old side saddle. There were some pomegranate bushes by the front door, and in the backyard behind the kitchen was an arbor with the first big Malaga grapes I ever tasted, although I had plenty of experience with the black and white scuppernogs, experience which included the bellyache and later a dipper full of cool, tart, homemade grape wine from the spring houses on the little farmsteads I shot over. Also in the backyard was a fig tree with huge black figs that broke open in sticky white cracks and attracted hordes of birds and June bugs and bumblebees, and a towering pecan which hailed storms of rich nuts in the fall. I never spent much more time inside the house than I could help, but it was very comfortable for that time. It had a big Kalamazoo stove in the parlor where nobody but the preacher ever sat, and an awful picture of a big St. Bernard dog looking after a little girl. It had a big kitchen where old Galena, the cook, was queen, and an off kitchen where there was a pump shelf with a graniteware basin and a dirty roller towel. On the ceiling near the pump shelf was a rafter with 2 holes bored in it, where my Aunt May had a swing when she was a little girl. The holes are still there. As a matter of fact, the whole house is still there. It was made out of fat pine so hard you had to bore holes to drive the nails in. Not being very firmly anchored to the earth, it could sway its hips in a storm without sagging out of plumb or blowing away. That house is about 100 years old, and it has weathered all the hurricanes, Alice, Ethel, Helen, and lately Donna, that have come along since hurricanes became latterly fashionable along that part of the rugged Carolina coast. Maybe we would lose a gross of shingles, perhaps, while the modern houses with basements were skittering off in the breeze, but the old man's house kept stubbornly standing, as did the handful of other old houses lovingly shaped before man discovered the shoddy speed up. During the Depression years, during the war and after, I had a fixation about that house. It had been rented to a variety of families through the lean and the better years to follow. Families careless of the love that went into its construction and the solid fun that was partial to its planking. I saw it a few years after the war when I went south on some business or other and took my dog Schnorkel with me. It was a sad house. It was a sad house, as so many houses become pathetic when they are no longer filled with tumbling children and sprawling dogs. The old man's house had been filthed and abused. For 17 years the strangers who lived in it beat it up. The rose bushes died, and the chandelier with the tinkling glass prisms fell down. That chandelier, which had seen Christmas dinners with loaded boards of wild turkey and venison standing just a whiff away from Galina's kitchen, whence came the odors of spicy fruit cake and frizzling ham and baking cookies. The ancient slatted shutters were sagging crazily from the broken windows, banging in the wind, and the porch had rotted and fallen in. The roses were gone from the side yard, replaced by sandspurs and dandelions, and the neat borders of perennials were long withered or shrunken brown stalks. But the magnolia was there, bigger and taller than ever, with one of the succession of mockingbirds still shouting his silver serenade on the moonlit nights. The grape arbor was gone, its framework collapsed, but there was the stump of the fig tree and the tall bole remaining of a sick pecan. At the time, the boy was having his troubles in a man's world, but the sight of that house made me fair sick. I didn't have any loose money, and I was living in New York and traveling all over the globe. I think having the dog with me did it. I got to thinking about all the things that had happened to me with that house as a base, all the things I had done, all the things I had learned in the house and from that house. Most of the things that I value today had started in that house. Started when I was a small, fat, cowlick boy with lop ears, spending as much time as I could in it. That house combined Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter and summertime in an ordered world of guns and dogs and boats and fish and ducks and quail. It was a cathedral of ancient times when children were accorded dignity according to how they earned it, and adults were merely small boys grown older. That was not just a house. That house was me. I had fallen out of the magnolia and had shot one of the mockingbirds, for which I suffered both physically and emotionally. I had gathered the pecans and fought the birds for the fig. The oak grove was still there by the side of the house, and gnarled old branches still hung with Spanish moss, and I had played baseball under its shade. Over the hill was the cottage and beaver dam and Dutchman's Creek, where I had safaried before I knew there was such a word as safari. From the front yard there was the water coast with its cedar bench and a row of salt-silvered old houses, and I bet myself that I could still find the old wreck close to where the fish always bit well. The dog ran into the weed-grown yard and laid his black square muzzle flat on the ground and stuck his bob-tailed behind into the air, wanting to play. There was still a mockingbird. It attempted a scherzo. In the oak grove, there was a flash of blue, a scuff of wings, and the harsh calling of a jay. The wind came up freshly from the water in its burden of salt and tar and faintly fish. It was October, 1949, and the squirrel season was on. The hounds would be bellowing in the crisp October woods as they coursed the big buck deer, whose necks were swelling as the frost brought the rutting season and its disregard of consequence. On the beaches at Baldhead and Corncake, the blues would be running in the sloughs, and occasionally the big silver slabs of channel bass would be striking. There were still quail in these parts, and the season would be opening next month. and the dogs would be whining in the backyard. Possums would be curled in gray balls in the naked persimmons trees, and the woods would be full of blue drifting wood smoke, and the evening cries of the colored children driving the cows home. Hog killing time was just around the corner. I was wearing a Countess Maria necktie and driving a blue Buick convertible. I was writing a syndicated newspaper column and selling stuff to magazines and going to the Stork Club and 21 for lunch. Toots Shore called me by my first name, and I was living in a penthouse and owed money to the bank. And I felt like a complete fraud. I felt like I was wearing somebody else's clothes and driving somebody else's car and going around under somebody else's name, so long as the old man's house stood there empty and sad, lonely and despoiled of firelight and laughter. So, of course, you know what I did? I had the Mockingbird and I had the Magnolia, and all I needed was the mortgage. I went to see the man people called a skinflint and told him that I was the old man's boy, grown considerably older. He said he remembered me. I don't know if he actually did, but this old man, he was sere and crisp frail as a leaf before it falls. That people called a skinflint said he would be glad to sell me the house back, and for exactly as much as the amount of the mortgage for which he had foreclosed it. Perhaps he was a skinflint, but could have gotten 3 times as much as the mortgage warranted, for the country was fat with post-war prosperity, and housing was acutely short. Skinflint or not, he had awaited death on the strength of his promise to keep the house in the family. I bought back the house, not because I could use it, but because I needed it. The house sits proud and freshly painted today on its corner. Its flowers are cherished, its interior restored. A woman who was born in the house, my mother, is its chatelaine. My father watches television in the back living room where the old man used to listen to the lugubrious whine of the wreck of the old 97 on one of those Longhorn gramophones. The little girl who swung on the back porch, a grandmother for many years now, lives down the street. There are lights and voices in the house again, and from time to time dogs and children. Rich black laughter is heard in the kitchen, and the old-time smells still come tantalizing into the dining room, where the old glass chandelier used to swing. Corn and butter beans and hot biscuits are still cooked in that kitchen, and the brandy is soaked in the Christmas fruit cake, as in times past. It is amazing how the time passes. There was a letter the other day from the bank that holds the mortgage saying that we don't owe any money on the old man's house anymore. The old man's house is free of strangers and makes a happy harbor for cheerful ghosts. The magnolia and the mockingbird are safe again, and the flowers bloom, and somehow I thought that the old man might like to know it.